I'd like to start by offering my condolences to Laceys family and friends. This is obviously an extremely difficult time for everyone who knew this couple. It's always a tragedy when someone chooses to take a life under any circumstances, especially when the death occurs at the start of Family Violence Prevention Month. I understand the public and the media have many questions about this case and our interaction with this couple prior to the homicide. I will make every effort to answer whatever questions I can. However, as you'll appreciate in this case, as this case is still before the courts, I'm limited into what I can say, so I'll take any questions that you may have right now.
Can you just discuss the police involvement prior to this happening?
Well, that's still under investigation, and it forms part of the homicide investigation. So I'm reluctant to get into specifics in regard to what interactions occurred, what happened. I can tell you that there was one file that was open relative to a vehicle theft that we're still investigating. There was evidence that was obtained that's currently at the crime lab.
Were there any specific domestic incidents you had responded to?
Well, again, that forms part of the investigation to get the accurate details as relate to that. But there was calls that related to the relationship between Lacey and the accused.
On Friday, we were told that the initial contact was made, at least with the guy, in August. Can you tell us what happened then?
No. The interactions that occurred may very well form part of the case that's going to be presented in court. So I'm reluctant to get into specifics of any details that could be presented at a later time in court. But what I can tell you is all of those details will come up during the court case.
Laceys Mom told a number of media that she was encouraged by police not to talk to media. Why would that be?
Well, there's two things that you have to understand. Number one, it's an active homicide investigation. At the time that those comments were made, our investigators were trying to pull the facts together. And what's really important when you're putting a case of this seriousness together, that information isn't planted in people's heads through the media, because we need to get statements from people that are not influenced by what they may have heard in the media. So when our investigators said, look, you know what, it would help our investigation if you would hold off releasing information or not going to the media, it would make our job, our ability to do a comprehensive and thorough investigation that much better. At no time was there ever any indication or was there any effort to inhibit her ability to complain about the police. I mean, the reality is, if people choose to complain about actions of the police or if they have a concern, we're never going to discourage that. But what we will do is when there's an active investigation and information that's released through the media could have a detrimental effect or certainly influence the investigation, we will encourage people to please hold off until we can do our investigative part.
So
Sorry.
the mother had said that she feels the police failed her, but then there's other people who say, well, Lacey didn't really want help, that she just kept kind of going back into the situation. Can you shed any light on which way you feel about this?
What I can say is domestics are extremely difficult to deal with for a number of circumstances. We get 16,000 domestic calls a year. We have an incredibly comprehensive system. Are we always looking at improvements? Always. But our domestic conflict unit takes the most serious of those high-risk domestics, family violence situations. We prioritize those using a risk assessment form for the family. And we're currently managing 300 high-risk domestic situations. Those are included in the 16,000 calls we get every year. The reality is we're managing all the time that whole area around risk and around domestics, and we're always looking at ways where we can do better. We rely on a system in Calgary that's the best of its kind anywhere, and I'm talking about Homefront. The linkage between the police, between the Crown, between social services, caseworkers, shelters, that relationship is hugely important. As was mentioned earlier in some of the conversations on the weekend, there are a variety of places that an individual can go if they feel they want advice or they need help with a family violence relationship. So as far as the specifics of what happened, when it happened, how it happened, I wish we could talk in more detail about that. The reality is we have an ongoing investigation. We have a case that's in front of the courts. We have to be incredibly diligent in what we say and what we do, because we do not want to jeopardize an investigation by saying or doing anything that could influence or cause that case to be put at risk.
Chief, I'm cognizant of what you just said about being limited on details, but this arises out of your answer as well.
Okay, no, go ahead,
and that is about the domestic conflict unit. Is there anything you can say about whether any of these prior interactions were reviewed by DCU, or whether they met the criteria to have the case referred to DCU at any point?
What I can tell you is, at this point in time, with the information that we have available, there were components that were being investigated, absolutely. Did it reach the threshold that it was one of the top 300? No, it did not.
The Homefront actually sent out a press release saying that if the domestic conflict response team had been involved, this could have been prevented. So is that because the DCRT is only in certain areas of Calgary that they wouldn't have been involved, or because it didn't qualify? Like, just that their press release kind of left that open.
Sure, and you know what, you probably have to talk to them about that. But let me tell you about the way domestic calls work in Calgary. As I say, 16,000 calls a year, just a bit under last year when we have the first full year of information. Each one of those calls is attended by a police officer. If it's what we call meeting the criteria for intimate partnerships, so in other words, current and former dating relationships, current and former common law relationships, current and former married relationships, persons who are the parents of one or more children, regardless of their marital status or whether they have lived together at any time, a family violence investigative report goes in. If there's multiple other types of domestic calls, like for instance, son and parent, daughter and guardian, whatever, we still put a risk assessment on those. So all of those will be assessed. So we have officers that attend. We have the highest risk ones that go to the domestic conflict unit. The risk assessments are done on all those calls so they can prioritize them. Domestic conflict unit looks at the highest risk. We are also piloting DCRT, domestic conflict response teams. Now, from a police perspective, I would never in 100 years say that anything would ensure that something wouldn't happen. But what I will tell you is this: we are always looking at new ways and better ways to do business. We are looking at, of course, because DCRT was a pilot project, we're quite happy with the results of that. We will be expanding that. What was part of our 3-year business plan, and we'll be expanding that in 2013 and 2014. Over and above that, we're a big supporter of Connect. Connect is a one call that a person can make, one number. A person can make that call if they want to know who they should call relative to a particular situation that they face. The answer could be the police. The answer could be that it's one of the women's shelters that are in town. It could be Homefront. It could be any number of options that are available. So what we've endeavored to do in Calgary with all of the partnerships that we have is to create this unbroken series of agencies all working together to minimize, and you'll note, minimize the potential for this to happen. Anytime there's a homicide, I want to make this point, anytime there's a homicide, the system is broken down somewhere. I don't care if it's a gang homicide, domestic homicide, if it's a child that's been killed, and you know we've had some of those. The reality is, in a perfect world, we'd like to be able to prevent all homicides. What I can tell you is, when it comes to domestic relationships, domestic violence, we continue to look at new ways that we can provide a quality of service, recognizing that as we, the police, are part of the system, and that we require the immense support and cooperation we get from so many other agencies. And even in the education piece with families, letting them know what the risk factors are to help them identify when a family member may be involved in a relationship that's just unhealthy. So do we have a long ways to go? Absolutely. Until we eliminate these, we've got a long ways to go. Have we come a long ways from where we were? Yeah. But it's a moving target, and we will never give up on endeavoring to change the process that addresses this issue.
Is there a point of frustration for your members in responding to reports of domestic threats, is there anything that is a particular point of frustration in dealing, with those kinds of reports?
I'm not sure I understand, but what I will say is that our officers have the training now to recognize how complex family situations can be, how complex domestic abuse can be, that it's more than just the issue around was somebody assaulted, for instance. There's so many other types of abuse. There's emotional abuse, there's financial abuse, there's efforts that are made by some people to use the kids as weapons in harassment. The reality is our officers recognize now how complex and how difficult these situations are. Do they get frustrated at times? Because, for instance, you can have a suspicion that there's someone, an abuser, who is doing certain things, and we haven't yet achieved the investigative or the evidentiary threshold to lay charges? Sure, but that does not cause that frustration to do less. It causes those officers to work harder.
Chief, the mother had said that she was not directed towards any agencies or social programs by the police. Is there any protocol in place when they're involved to do that, to direct victims towards the home front and the baseline from them?
Well, and we're still looking at what was said and what wasn't said, but and we were I'm using this opportunity to get the word out. One thing we've done over the years, and we look back, Connect was implemented, for instance, about 2 years ago. It received a lot of publicity as it related to, well, what is Connect? Well, Connect is a one-stop shop, one phone call where you can ask about domestic violence, about abuse, about sexual assault. It goes on and on. So we try to get the message out there. We try to get the message out there through dinners, and I can tell you that there's been so many agencies in town that do dinners and talks to speak to the variety of agencies that are available. So if our officers didn't mention it, I don't know, I can't say for sure, but I do know that, again, it's one of those things where there's great effort being made to let the public know that there's a multitude of agencies that are out there to assist.
Is there a protocol in place where if an officer is involved in, and it's involved in domestic violence, steer the victim towards this agency or that agency?
No, there's no protocol that exists. We rely on the training so that officers, just like you can't possibly train to or have a policy in place that it would be volumes and volumes. Our officers are trained to know those agencies and to pass that to relate that information on to those families. So is there a requirement, and in every case you have to sit down with the officer or with the person to outline every agency that exists? No. What our officers do, and they do an excellent job of it. They do an excellent job of it. They will let that person know what they can do to assist based on the facts that they have presented to them. So I'm totally confident that our officers, in the vast majority of cases, do not require the chief of police to put out a protocol or another policy that says, in every case you will go through this litany of agencies. What they do is they will listen, they'll assess, they inform, and they help those people that they're working with to try to identify what course of action is best for them.
Can you say, obviously the mom is looking to place blame on someone right now, and she feels that blame should be placed on police. I know there's an investigation that you have to go through, but based on what you know now, can you see which direction it's going through, or are you confident that police did all that they could do, or is that too hard to say right now?
What I can say is we are still gathering all the facts. What I can say is that this is a tragedy. Let's just say it like it is. I mean, it's tragic that a young life was lost. Let's not lose sight of the fact that there's a single person that's responsible for this, and that's the person that is responsible for it, okay? Let's not lose that fact. We will look to see if there's anything we can do that can enhance our response to this, and we are going through that process. What I can also say is that clearly all the facts, the chain of events that led up to this form part of the investigation, and it will be coming out in court. And rather than me stand up here and say one thing or another, and being viewed as being even, the reality is all those facts will come up in due time. And otherwise, I really can't comment, but other than that.
Chief, can you tell us typically how much time passes from the time that the initial call or the officers attend a home where there has been a complaint? Are they solely responsible for determining how far that complaint's going to go up the chain in terms of risking or the risk assessment?
Well, all of those domestic calls that I've talked about, there is a report that goes in. That, now you have to understand, many of these calls are such that there is no event that even happened. There is no criminal threshold that's been reached. It may be something as simple as a domestic standby. They want advice. They're going over to get furniture. We don't know how this is going to go. Can you, so an officer can pretty much assess that. But as you go through and elevate through the various circumstances, then I can tell you that in cases, as I've outlined, where there's been violence or the threat of violence, it does go to the domestic conflict unit where they do an assessment, they make an evaluation, and the highest risk ones then go to DCU.
And the time may vary depending on the nature of the circumstance.
Well, it's fairly quick. They work they work really hard, and the more it does get up there in a timely fashion. Let's face it. There's calls they go to where they arrest the individual at the scene or shortly thereafter. They take the person down to the arrest processing unit. They do the paperwork for an emergency protection order. The conditions are outlined there. It goes on CPIC, and you know what? That's pretty immediate. So there's a whole series of checks and balances that occur to do what you say. Sometimes it's immediate. Sometimes there's an evaluation component. Sometimes it's long-term and chronic, and there's a greater degree of attention that has to be developed and used or given to it to develop a proper strategy.
Do you get the impression that from the officers on the street that a restraining order, Laceys' mother made some comment or a comment about officers that she spoke with at some point, saying that restraining orders were somewhat useless. Do you get the impression that that's a common thought by officers on the street?
No, I don't think that's a common thought at all. The reality is that each of these things that I talk about, each of the steps has a value. An emergency protection order has a value. Restraining order has a value. But at the end of the day, what the officers may be saying is that they are a piece of paper that allow the police to take other certain actions. So I'm not sure, because without knowing what the officer said exactly and then saying to him, what did you mean by that, I can't say. But that all of those steps have value. Restraining orders have value. Emergency protection orders have value. Peace bonds have value. And those are the things we look at for each and every circumstance.
Just out of curiosity, because it could very well be no, but have you been in contact personally with her mom?
No.
Have you investigated?
You know what? You're going to have to. I'm sure they've been in contact with her, because based on your stories, there was a conversation relative to what you brought up, or one of you brought up earlier, about whether there was any discouragement from her going to the media. Explain that the investigators said that so that they could maintain the integrity of the investigation as best as possible.
Chief, is there a concern on your part that somehow this has shaken public confidence, or that maybe someone who's in a situation where they should be contacting police, I'm going to drag the question out, have decided not to go forth? Are you concerned that people are reacting negatively to?
I'm always concerned about anyone who may take a one-off and then form a judgment based on that. We're into almost November here. We've had, as I recall, and it needs to be corrected, one domestic related homicide out of the 2 domestic related homicides this year. Previous years we've had 12 and 13, I think, if I remember. 10 and 9, 09 and 10, or 10 and 11. So you know what? The reality is, as I say, 16,000 calls. We take 250,000 calls. We're dealing with a very, very complicated situation when it's domestic violence or domestic abuse, and that's why it's so important that we work as closely as we do with our partners.